There's a cannabis strain sitting in dispensaries all over the world called lamb's bread. It's on jars, it's on menus, and people pay extra for it. But there's just one problem. Lamb's bread was never the name of a strain at all. It was a Jamaican expression, and the guy who made it famous, Bob Marley, was using it to say something completely different from what everybody thinks. This is the real story of lamb's bread. So let's go back to where this whole thing started. It started with an interview Bob Marley did with High Times magazine back in 1976. In it, Marley tells this story about being handed a full branch of herb, a whole tree of it to be exact, that was grown wild in Jamaica. And he starts to explain how to him it's perfect and how it was the best he's ever had. So naturally he tries to put into words what makes herb that good. And the words he chooses are the entire reason we're here. He doesn't describe a specific plant. He describes a threshold. He says that when herb has that kind of power, that's what you call lamb's bread. And that's the story right there. Lamb's bread was never the name of one particular weed. It was what Jamaicans called any weed once it hit that top level. And then he sums the whole thing up in one line by saying, good herb is what you call lamb's bread. Because Marley wasn't naming a plant with a pedigree. He was handing out a compliment. Lamb's bread wasn't a strain. It was the highest thing you could say about a bag of herb. And Jamaicans had been using it that way for a long time. In Jamaican Rastafarian speech, calling herb lamb's bread meant it was blessed, holy, the good stuff. So when growers today print lamb's bread on a jar like it's the name of a strain, it's a little strange. It's like naming your weed top shelf. You're not giving it a name, you're just calling it good. But calling it good is actually underselling it by a mile, because once you unpack those two words, you realize how heavy they are. So let's take them one at a time. First, the lamb. In Christianity, the lamb is Jesus. That's one of his oldest nicknames, the Lamb of God, the innocent one who gets sacrificed so everybody else can be saved. So right there, the lamb isn't a small word. It's the holiest figure there is. Now bring in the bread. The most sacred thing Christians do is communion. And communion goes back to the Last Supper, where Jesus picks up a piece of bread, tells his followers, "This is my body," and says, "Keep doing this to remember me." So ever since, eating that bread is how you take a piece of Christ into yourself. Now put the two together. Lamb's bread. You're taking the holiest figure in the faith and the holiest act in the faith, and you're pinning both of them onto a bag of herb. You're not saying it's strong. You're saying it's sacred, that smoking it is its own kind of communion. Now that's not no stoner talk. That's church. Now that you know what the phrase actually means, there's one more thing to clear up about it, and that's how you even spell it. Because there's a long-running argument over whether it's lamb's bread or lamb's breath, and the evidence is pretty clean. If you dig through vintage Jamaican dub records, you find multiple old tracks titled Lamb's Bread. You will not find vintage tracks called Lamb's Breath. Bread came first. Breath is most likely what happens when an outsider hears Jamaican patois, which softens the tige sound, and writes down what he thought he heard. So if the phrase came from Rastafarian faith, the next question is how cannabis even got to a Caribbean island in the first place. And the answer is not the one most people assume. And it starts with the end of slavery. When Britain abolished it, with full effect in 1838, Jamaica's entire plantation system lost its workforce in one stroke. So the plantation owners went looking for cheap labor somewhere else, and they found it in India. From then into the early 1900s, tens of thousands of Indian workers were brought to Jamaica, and they brought cannabis seeds with them. And on top of that, they brought the word ganja with them. Ganja comes from Sanskrit, through Hindi, straight into Jamaican English. So the most Jamaican word in weed is actually an Indian one. But the word was only the beginning, because the plant itself started moving too. It spread from the Indian laborers to the Afro-Jamaican working class and the rural poor, and it became part of ordinary life rather than a party drug. People drank ganja tea and used it for fever, colds, and stress. It was the working people's medicine. But then out of nowhere came the law. The ganja law of 1913 banned growing and importing it, with a penalty of a 100-pound fine or up to a year in prison. And you can see the real purpose in the language the lawmakers used at the time. They were worried about ganja smoking among what they called the natives of the colony. This wasn't a health law. It was a control law. And a 100-pound fine back then was a life-destroying amount of money for a poor laborer. So thousands of people went to jail. And then the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1948 tightened that grip even further, reinforcing criminalization and setting the framework that American pressure would later exploit. But no law was going to stop what happened next, because right as the bans were tightening, a whole new religion was forming around that exact plant. Which brings us to the faith that turned that banned plant into a sacrament. On November 2nd, 1930, a man named Rastafarian was crowned Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia. And to a lot of Jamaicans, that fulfilled a prophecy. Years earlier, the Pan-African leader Marcus Garvey had told his followers to look to Africa for the crowning of a black king who would be a redeemer. And when Selassie was crowned, they believed that was the man. And out of that moment, the Rastafari movement was born. And in that movement, herb was never recreational. It's a sacrament with actual scripture behind it. Rastafari point to Genesis, where God gives every seed-bearing herb to man. They point to Revelation, where the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. That's where the phrase healing of the nation comes from. The Nyabingi order, the oldest of the Rastafari mansions, made the ceremonial use of cannabis central to their Nation gatherings, burning the herb during drumming and prayer. They also call it the wisdom weed and the holy herb. But this part really matters, because Rastafari doctrine actually condemns smoking just to get stoned. The herb is for meditation, for insight, for connecting to God. So the people who coined the phrase lamb's bread weren't grading a product. They were describing something they considered holy. Now you might be wondering where the best herb actually came from. And the truth is, it grew just about everywhere on that island. But a handful of spots earned a real reputation for it. You had Westmoreland, way out on the western tip, which people swore grew some of the finest. You had St. Anne up on the north coast, which just so happens to be the parish Marley himself was born in. And then you had the deep, untamed mountains right in the middle of the island, where the plants basically grew wild with nobody watching them. And every single one of those places grew something a little different from the next. One study that sampled plants along the south coast found that around 95% of them had a different genetic makeup. That's not one strain. That's an entire island of them. And the classic Jamaican landrace was a monster. According to Dr. Michelle Emmanuel of the University of the West Indies Mona campus, it could grow 10 feet tall, with thin spiny leaves and airy buds, and it could take up to 6 months to mature. Modern versions sold under the lamb's bread name finish in more like 10 to 14 weeks, which tells you how much has changed. What it looked like is more consistent though. It looked like bright light green buds with golden amber hairs that were sticky with resin. And the smell it had is skunky and cheesy over an earthy base, sometimes even having citrus or pine cutting through. And the high it had is the classic Jamaican daytime sativa. Energetic, uplifting, euphoric, creative, and clear-headed. People regularly describe it as meditative or spiritual rather than just strong. Now for the potency, and this is where I have to be straight with you. Modern lamb's bread gets listed around 16 to 21% THC. and some sellers claim even higher. But the real old Jamaican landrace was nothing like that. According to Emmanuel's research, it ran roughly 8 to 11% THC and had around 5 to 6% CBD in it. So the herb Marley's generation actually smoked was about half as strong as what's sold under the name today. So anybody that's selling you lamb's bread with 25% THC in it is selling you a modern plant with an old name on it. So let's talk about the man whose name is welded to all of this. Bob Marley. He was born in 1945 in St. Anne. He grew up partly in the Trenchtown neighborhood of Kingston, around the same cramped government yards that produced some of the greatest reggae music ever recorded. He was raised Catholic and got into Rastafari in the mid-60s, fully embracing the faith by the end of the decade. He was arrested for cannabis in 1968. And he always talked about the herb as revelation, not intoxication, describing it as something that reveals yourself to you. And he didn't keep that to himself. As his music exploded, he carried that whole way of seeing herb out into the world with him. Then he went global and took Jamaican ganja culture with him. His album Catch a Fire and the tour behind it broke reggae internationally in 1973. Then Exodus in 1977. And suddenly, the whole planet had a picture in its head of what Jamaican herb meant. His Wailers bandmate Peter Tosh was even more direct about it. Because in 1976, the exact same year as Marley's High Times interview, Tosh released his solo album, Legalize It, which was an entire record built around the argument that marijuana should be legal. So you had two members of the same band, the same year, making the same case from two different angles. And here's what almost nobody puts together. At the exact same time, the music was exporting the culture. Jamaica was exporting the actual product on a massive scale. By the mid-80s, Jamaica was reported as the second largest supplier of marijuana to the United States, behind Colombia. And for a while, marijuana was one of the most valuable things the entire Jamaican economy produced. But then, the hammer came down. And through the late 70s and the 80s, the United States pushed hard on Jamaica to wipe out its ganja trade. There was military aid, there were agreements between the two governments, and there were aerial spraying campaigns. The DEA's Operation Buccaneer launched in 1975, and it was one of the first coordinated U.S. Jamaican eradication efforts, and it set the template for the campaigns that followed. One reggae artist even released a song in 1982 called Police and Helicopter, protesting the burning of the fields, and the title alone tells you what daily life had become. Villages out in the growing parishes were getting raided by units who were dropped in from helicopters. And to make things worse, the plant itself was getting killed off from a second direction at the same time. Since a 10-foot sativa is easy to spot from a helicopter, farmers started to switch to shorter, faster plants that they could hide by crossbreeding the tall Jamaican sativas with imported indica strains for quicker harvests. But here's the ugly irony about all of this, according to Emmanuel's research. Those hybrids were actually worse for Jamaica. They were more prone to pests and mold in the local conditions. His finding was blunt. Put the different varieties in the same conditions for the same amount of time, and the original landrace always wins, because it's the one that's actually adapted to that island. And the wild part is that somebody called this decline decades ago. Marley himself saw it coming, because in that same 1976 interview, he complained that the Jamaican herb reaching the States had already gotten worse because people were rushing the harvest and over-fertilizing to keep up with demand. But sadly, Marley never saw most of what came after. Because he was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive cancer in 1977, and he sadly passed away in 1981 at just 36 years old. And at his funeral, his widow Rita Marley placed a stalk of cannabis in his casket, along with a Bible. So that alone should tell you more about what the herb meant to him than any strain menu ever will. But the good thing is, the genetics didn't die completely, and somebody's been fighting for them. His name is Dr. Michel Emmanuel, and he's from the University of the West Indies Mona campus, and he has spent years hunting down and growing out the original Jamaican landraces. In one case, he hiked 6 hours into the bush to reach a Rastafarian who'd been living in isolation for about 40 years, because that man still had the old seed. His argument is simple, and it's correct. Jamaica's entire reputation was built on these plants. He's even pushed for a protected status for Jamaican cannabis, the way real champagne only comes from champagne. And in 2015, Jamaica finally changed the law, decriminalizing small amounts and letting households grow a few plants, and formally protecting Rastafari sacramental use. And that last part made Jamaica the first country in the Western Hemisphere to legally allow it.